This is our second session studying Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, and today we're going to start to consider some of the characters in the story. Ideally, I would like you to have read the story in full at this point. If you haven't, that's okay, but there may first of all be some spoilers in here, and second of all, you may struggle to get a full overview of the themes. I find in this story, looking at individual characters is the best way to explore the themes of the story, because Achebe tends to attach concepts and ideas that we can discuss to specific characters. So I'll focus on those individual characters and consider how each of them could be used in an exam question. And I'll run along the side some key words you could look out for in an IB Paper 2 exam that might trigger a response using one of these characters. I'm going to consider this in two different parts because there's a lot of characters and themes to go through. First, we're going to look at the characters Okonkwo, Unoka, and Nwoye. And here we're going to look specifically at the themes of masculinity, family relations, change, and tradition. Okonkwo is the flawed protagonist of this story, and he's our main character. We're with him from the very beginning of the story all the way to the end. And of course he's important to consider because his story is the one through which we glimpse into this society. A good way to describe Okonkwo might be as a tragic hero. Maybe you've heard that term before. A tragic hero is usually the protagonist of a tragic story. They usually have heroic qualities that put the audience on their side, but also make mistakes or have flaws that end up leading to their demise. Those mistakes are particularly painful for an audience when we see how the difficulties of their life might have led them there. This is really useful to know because it can make a great example with other texts. If, for instance, you're studying definitely things like Shakespeare's tragedies, something like Macbeth or Othello, considering your two protagonists as tragic heroes can be a fantastic comparison. Usually tragic heroes possess what we call a fatal flaw. So that is a key characteristic, a negative trait that, though very common and very human, pushes them to such an extent that leads to their downfall. Those might be things like selfishness, ambition, greed, flaws we all possess to some extent, and in the right situation, might lead to anyone's demise. So what are your opinions of Okonkwo as a character? What were your first impressions when you started reading them, and how did they change? Well, if it's not 100% positive, that's okay. Just because a character is a protagonist doesn't mean they need to be our best friend. There's certainly some actions Okonkwo chooses to take that we may struggle to rationalise morally, but we can consider him from more of a distance to process him as a part of his society. I would say the first thing we notice about Okonkwo is his obsession with masculinity and a focus on physical and emotional strength. So in a physical sense, we know that his status, his position in the village, comes from beating the cat in a wrestling match. It's one of the first things we learn about him. So we know that physical strength is something that's incredibly important in this society and is therefore important to Okonkwo. Physical strength therefore blends with these other characteristics we have here of masculinity and authority when it comes to being a strong husband and father. Okonkwo prides himself on his strength because society prides him on his strength. As a father, a husband, a fighter and a farmer, as well as a member of the community. And these I've lined up with specific character traits that are not only important in the value system of this community, but are the central motivations for Okonkwo's character. So let's think about what strength means to Okonkwo. I've chosen 3 quotes here that I feel represent some of those attributes that we've considered, but there are many quotes from Things Fall Apart that discuss Okonkwo's obsession with various types of strength. The first quotation puts an emphasis on self-sufficiency. He prides himself on not relying on others, as well as being self-disciplined farmer. He'll put in the hard work to get results. When we come to Noye, we'll see though how Okonkwo's obsession with responsibility and self-sufficiency can place undue judgment on his son. Here, Achebe, in the second quote, mentions his fiery temper. Okonkwo's temper is compared to a fire, something that is strong, unstoppable, perhaps unpredictable. His temper can rise from nowhere and be incredibly destructive to those around him. He's described to rule his household, a verb we usually use for royalty, which also links to that idea of respectability in the community, which occasionally means enacting physical strength and authority upon your own family. We see that even more so in the final quotation. When it comes to proving his authority and masculinity to his wives, Okonkwo is fearless. And yet it is here that we start to see some possible weaknesses creeping in. He occasionally gets into trouble for instance, beating his wife on a holy day. Though he craves being respected in the community, he's not always totally respectful of community values. And so Achebe makes it clear to us very early on that this outer strength gives way to an inner weakness. Each of those social expectations we mentioned in the last slide acts as a book of laws in this community. The punishment for breaking them is social reprimand, isolation and judgment. And that's where Okonkwo's fear starts to come in. Perhaps down in his heart, Okonkwo was not a cruel man, but his whole life was dominated by fear, the fear of failure and of weakness. And Achebe's voice shines through here, speaking to us almost directly, and we can tell this is something Achebe wants to get through to us. By fear, the fear of. We have that repetition where Achebe reminds us how central this is to Okonkwo's character. And naturally, that word central aligns with that imagery down in his heart. We often associate deep and core characteristics with a space inside us that is hidden and inaccessible. What this tells us is it's from a place inside him so deep that perhaps he doesn't even know. It tells us that Okonkwo isn't aware of his own flaws, even though they motivate him much more deeply than the traits he'd surely like to assign to himself. Achebe also uses the passive voice here. His life was dominated by fear. Using the passive voice shows us that Okonkwo is passive here. He is controlled by the fear. And finally, as I've mentioned, that word perhaps is interesting as well. Again, it sets up this feeling that Achebe is talking conversationally to us, but also shows that perhaps Achebe isn't even sure. Sometimes it's hard to tell from Okonkwo's actions that he has good intentions at heart. So could this be Okonkwo's fatal flaw? His fear of weakness? That is one argument. And certainly when we come to look at religion, change and tradition, colonialism, there will be other sides of the story as to what leads to Okonkwo's ultimate downfall. But we could certainly make the argument that Okonkwo's fatal flaw is exactly this, his fear of being perceived as weak by his society. And that can make a great essay if you're following along with the doc. Would you describe Okonkwo as strong or weak? I think there's examples on both sides. This emphasis on strength and fear of weakness is a constant internal battle for Okonkwo. The irony of the story is that it is Okonkwo's ultimate fear that causes him to act irrationally, emotionally. He loses all self-control and strength. He is made weak by a fear of weakness. How Okonkwo's desperation not to be seen as weak leads him to choices, or more realistically, impulses that cause him to give in to emotion and temper. Unoka is Okonkwo's father, and he's dead by the time the timeline of our story starts. But even in the short space of chapter 2, we learn a lot about his life. And though he's only a minor character, he can be very useful when it comes to assessing Okonkwo's motivations and values, as well as some of the most important themes in the novel. Achebe tells us that Okonkwo's fear of weakness comes directly from his father. Anoka has many traits, Anoka has many weaknesses, through which many societies may consider him a failure, and that's certainly the case for the Igbo tribe as well. Read these quotes and summarise what it is that we learn about Anoka through them. He is irresponsible. He was poor and his wife and children had barely enough to eat. Let's not forget that's Okonkwo that had to grow up off the back of Anoka's laziness. When he goes to the oracle to ask why his crops won't grow, he is given an almost comedic answer. The oracle assures him the gods have absolutely no problem with him. He is simply just too lazy to try. So his yam crops fail and his family remains poor. Note already that Okonkwo's emphasis on self-sufficiency, self-discipline, and hard work are completely at odds with what we've learned about Anoka so far. Furthermore, those traits of the fighter, of bravery and physical strength aren't something that Anoka possesses either. He doesn't even like talking about war, and that impacts on his masculinity, not only because physical strength and masculinity are valued, but also perhaps due to a duty to protect one's community. We see that when it comes to his borrowing as well. People swore never to lend him any more money because he never paid it back. So, what does it mean to have no value to a community? Well, Okonkwo would tell us you need to provide wealth, status, and warrior strength. Are there any other ways you could be valuable to a society? Really think about that. Is there anything else a person could do to bring value to their society? And could these ever outweigh money? I certainly think there are ways you can bring value to your community beyond wealth, status, and strength. In every community, there needs to be individuals who bring art, friendship, joy. And I think Anoka has some very positive qualities. They can be hard to see because the narrative often comes from not first person, but very close to Okonkwo. There is a nicely written passage about Anoka as a child. Anoka loved it all, and he loved the first kites that returned with the dry season and the children who sang songs of welcome to them. There are extended passages about Anoka's love of nature, of beautiful weather, of music. I find Achebe often paints Anoka with a sense of care and beauty, as though he is sort of misunderstood. And despite seeing the story through Okonkwo's perspective, we can see some positive qualities to Anoka. Even in that quotation which labelled him as lazy, we can see that he doesn't hoard his money. As soon as he gets some, he's quick to buy gifts for his friends and share his time with them. Take this beautiful description of Anoka's mind. Though the basis of the story is him refusing to pay a debt, as his mind wanders, we get a wonderful moment to bask in the beauty of Anoka's inner world. Anoka talked about music and his face beamed. He could hear in his mind's ear the blood-stirring and intricate rhythms of the ekwe and the udu and the ogene, and he could hear his own flute weaving in and out of them, decorating them with a colourful and plaintive tune. So far, we've covered implicitly a lot of the themes that could come up on an IB Paper 2 question, whether that's considering gender expectations or even things like ambition and social responsibility. And though we never see an interaction between them, Achebe very quickly sets up this dichotomy between Okonkwo and Anoka. We learn that Okonkwo was ashamed of his father. All of his fear and anxiety comes from a fear that he will be, or just be perceived to be, anything like Anoka. Okonkwo was ruled by one passion, to hate everything that his father Anoka had loved. So let's explore the differences between these two characters, and then consider If Okonkwo is ashamed of Anoka, is Achebe encouraging us to feel the same way? And there are plenty of categories in which their personalities are total opposites, where perhaps Okonkwo has modelled his personality around opposing his father, where Okonkwo is obsessed with the social expectations upon him, Anoka ignores them, whether that's a negative, such as not being able to feed his family, or a positive, in that he's free from the constraints of masculinity that rule Okonkwo's life. Anoka spends his life in debt, where Okonkwo, as soon as he is able, takes a small loan of seed yams and quickly works to turn a profit. Before long, the number of wives, huts, and yams he had become a symbol of that success. And whilst that success leads to a sense of responsibility over his family, Anoka avoids all responsibility to himself, his family, and the community, instead focusing on his passions. He is a musician and a friend. He feels love deeply and expresses it freely, where Okonkwo couldn't be any more different. He shows no emotion to those around him and is driven not by passion, but by logic. And though you absolutely should not say this on the exam, if you're interested in their personality types, I would say Anoka is the quintessential ENFP, extroverted and intuitive about the community around him. He feels strongly and lives in the moment. Yet Okonkwo is in each category the complete opposite. He is very private and bent on taking the world practically and exactly as it appears to him. He devalues feelings and lives for the rewards of the next harvest. But many fathers and sons don't get along. Why is it that Okonkwo is ashamed of Anoka and not the other way around? Well, perhaps it's because of their alignment with social expectations. Because Okonkwo's values align with those around him, he looks down on his father for not meeting them. I suppose, in my personal opinion though, I feel these deviations make Anoka a stronger character than his son Okonkwo. In the face of social expectations, Anoka doesn't care that he appears weak, which is his strength. Okonkwo is obsessed with appearing strong, which is his weakness. And furthermore, returning to that question, I believe that Achebe is encouraging me to reach this conclusion. I don't feel that as a reader we are encouraged to feel the same way. Take their deaths. Now, they both die a very tragic death, but their deaths are quite different. And I argue that in the different ways Achebe portrays their deaths, he is fostering a connection with Anoka that allows us to see his value beyond that of his contributions to society. Take this description of Anoka's death. Anoka died of a swelling which was an abomination to the earth goddess. When a man was afflicted with swelling in the stomach and the limbs, he was not allowed to die in the house. He was carried to the evil forest and left there to die. There was a story of a very stubborn man who staggered back to his house and had to be carried again to the forest and tied to a tree. The sickness was an abomination to the earth goddess, and so the victim could not be buried in her bowels. He died and rotted away above the earth, and was not given the first or the second burial. Such was Anoka's fate. When they carried him away, he took with him his flute. How is Anoka presented in this passage? Well, first, I think we feel sympathy for him. We learn about a disease he gets, which seems very painful, a swelling of the stomach. Then we learn he was left to die alone in the forest, and anyone can sympathise with the brutality of that death. We then hear an anecdote about another member of the village who refused to go to his death peacefully, and we're encouraged to picture that brutality of returning a man constantly to the forest so that he can die alone and in pain. But that's not Anoka, though I'm sure he'd heard this story in life. Anoka, though described as a coward earlier on in the story, is shown here to be resilient. He accepts his fate gracefully. And I think that final line is the most telling. When they carried him away, he took with him his flute. Onoka does not let the ugliness of the world destroy its beauty. And though he'll be on his own, I think Achebe is encouraging us to picture his last moments, enjoying the beauty of nature and music. His strength is to retain his passion even in the brutality of death. Pause this video and read this next quote. Once again, is there anything deeper than Achebe's words here? How are Okonkwo and Onoka presented differently? How does Achebe explore Okonkwo's shame? And how are we encouraged to feel about Onoka? Noye, Okonkwo's son, suffers from this generational conflict and the same pressures of masculinity. The values that Okonkwo reverted from his father, he sees glimpses of in his son Noye. He sees them as laziness and femininity. But there is an innocence to Noye that a reader cannot help but sympathise with. Noye knew that it was right to be masculine and to be violent, but somehow he still preferred the stories that his mother used to tell. Seeing Noye suffer this same generational conflict is fascinating. Yet this time it has a different result. In the end, it causes Noye to turn to a new way of life in Christianity. So why does Noye convert to Christianity? Well, firstly, as we've said, to simply reject all of the values of his father. Perhaps it's escaping his anger and violence, or perhaps it's some kind of rebellion. Which of those do you think? His conversion could be his rejection of that masculinity that Okonkwo exhibits, as well as the fact that it gives him the opportunity to become literate. We learn early on that Noye loves storytelling, and Christianity and the experience of going to church provides him with an outlet for that passion. Just like Onoka, he too has a passion for music, a passion which in Okonkwo's household he is unable to explore in the confines of his cultural community. And so Noye is a perfect representation of change and tradition. We're asked by Achebe to consider what could have been different. Is there any version of his relationship with his father that could have changed his fate? And these three characters we've discussed are very, very useful to explore in relation to one another, as they expose different perspectives of the same societal pressures that they endure. Furthermore, they actively influence one another. Take a moment to go to the worksheet and note down what you feel Noye's similarities to his father and his grandfather are, as well as his differences. Here are my answers. And if you weren't sure on these, take the answers that I've given you and find a quote from your story for each box which supports the point. I'm sure that it will be very useful when it comes to exam prep. So first of all, Noye and Onoka share a love of music and a general gentle spirit. Okonkwo sees and despises that in both of them because he feels it is not masculine enough. Okonkwo is terribly worried that Noye is not growing up into the man that Okonkwo wants him to be. However, Noye and Onoka aren't totally similar. In fact, I would say that one of their differences is that Onoka has little interest in the societal expectations put upon him and is not afraid to defy them for his own happiness, whereas Noye obsesses over his flaws. As we saw in that quote, he worries about what he should be versus what he is. And he worries that he's not a good enough son for his father. But in the end, both him and his father do something similar. They both rebel against their fathers. And so these three characters interact really well to each other to consider intergenerational rebellion. Both Okonkwo and Noye live to be the total opposite of the man that raised them. And in explaining that to us, Achebe opens opportunities to explore the value of masculinity and of family. He asks us to consider the value of this rebellion and conflict. Is there a world we can imagine where these three characters could have lived in harmony? What would that take? Learning how to compare and contrast characters and thereby relate them to the world in the different ways they interact with it is going to be a really essential skill for the very highest grade on the Paper 2 exam. And by understanding how different characters interact differently with their world, we can isolate those variables and consider what it is that Achebe would like us to understand.